Video games are very young. Like, think about it. Like, the first video game, depending on how you define it, was made in 1952. There's a whole Ahoy video about it, and it's an interesting discussion, but the conclusion that he comes to specifically is the year 1952. The first film, depending on who you ask, is The Arrival of a Train at La Ciotat Station, which was made in 1895, but can go even further back depending on how you define movie. And that's the closest sibling in age that video games have in terms of the media we consume day to day. The novel traces back to the 11th century with the Japanese novel Tale of Genji. Poetry and verse go even further back, and things like music and painting are things that we as a society have been taking part in since we've been able to smear stuff on a cave wall or stretch an animal skin around a wooden frame. Compared to that, a medium that only popped up halfway through the 20th century is absolutely baby. And while something like films were pretty quickly regarded for their artistic aspects, video games were stuck with the perception of just being toys for boys for a very long time. So as an artistic medium with value and room for expression, it's even younger, which makes for some really interesting comparisons. Like, one of the most interesting parts about video games to me is how we name genres. In things like film or fiction, we name genres based on the emotions that they evoke or by the tropes that they have in common. Romance has a lot of romance in it, action has action in it, thrillers make us feel thrilled, horror makes us feel horrified, etc. But in video games, we do genre a little bit differently. Sometimes we name genres on the core gameplay loop. First-person shooters are games where you are in first person and you shoot things with guns. Role-playing games are games where we role-play, which is a fancy word for pretending you are a character in the game. And sometimes we name genres based on the first game of its type, such as roguelikes, a genre named after the game Rogue, or adventure games, which got its name after Colossal Cave Adventure. Other text-based games in that era were called adventure games in the same way some games at the time were called Doom clones. But what's so fun is that because video games are so new, we're seeing new genres pop up on the regular now. Case in point, the walking simulator. A genre of video game which only just now started picking up steam and is something that I find a lot of value in. So this video started as an analysis of Dear Esther, a game that more or less created the genre in the way that we know it today. But as I started to work on it, I began to realize that the history of Dear Esther and the conversation to be had around the genre that it created is way more fascinating than the game itself, even though the game is absolutely incredible and I will still make that in-depth analysis one of these days. And so that's what I want to do today. I want to take a look at the walking simulator, where it comes from, major works in the genre, and why the walking simulator is, I think, the most valuable genre of video game out there today. Let me take you back to 2012 to 2014. And for those that know where this is going, I am sorry. An internet personality named Anita Sarkeesian is at the center of a targeted harassment campaign formulated on various Chan boards, which would come to be known as Gamergate, a movement which marked the first time that the alt-right moved its operation online, on which it has since thrived. In this campaign, while Anita Sarkeesian was very much the target, a lot of other people in games were caught up in the absolute shit show of anger and harassment. Any game that attempted to be even somewhat progressive was dumped on. So many death threats and acts of violence were carried out against folks that pushed for less toxic depictions of people in games. And around this same time, two games popped up that are pretty much responsible for an entire genre: Gone Home and Dear Esther. The term walking simulator originated from Steam's tagging system, which used to be way more user-driven than it is right now. Users used to be able to add their own tags to games, and with enough support from other users, that tag might show up when you went to that game's page. This tool was used a lot in the midst of Gamergate to target and demean various games by adding tags which insulted the game in any way possible. So when two games, one being queer and about women, and the other being, well, being about whatever Dear Esther is about, came out, that gave an incredibly easy target for people to go after. They started tagging the games as things like not a game or hipster garbage or, most interestingly, walking simulator. Walking simulators as a genre did not originate with Gone Home and Dear Esther. The earliest example of the genre is a game called The Forest, which was released all the way back in 1983 for the ZX Spectrum. But the term walking simulator didn't exist until Gamergate, because beforehand, walking simulators were always just filed under the adventure game genre, and with the Gamergate movement, a term was needed to describe these games which carried negative connotations and implied that these games were of low quality and or of very low effort, neither of which are true, by the way. Okay, so I'm gonna take a bit of a detour here and give a very Cliff Notes dissection of what Gamergate actually was and how it worked, because it gives us a lot of insight as to the value of walking simulators. So long story short, or long story medium I should say, Gamergate was an anti-progressive and anti-feminist movement spearheaded by 4chan's politically incorrect board. Although calling it a movement is giving it more credence than it really deserves, because in reality it was just a thinly veiled harassment campaign against a few women that existed in games journalism. Either way, what ended up happening was a handful of folks from places like Politically Incorrect, or POL for short, would stir up some trouble, and by doing so they would bait in a very specific demographic of person, usually young white men who were nervous and or fearful that their quote-unquote space was going to be taken away from them by framing feminist game journalists as wanting to take away the video games that they enjoy so much and make them feel safe. See, at the time, the predominant majority of gamers, and still to this day this remains the case, were cishet men, and because of that, a lot of video games were targeted towards the cishet man, which resulted in some less than savory depictions of women and a complete absence of anything even remotely queer. In this way, cishet male gamers felt that video games were a medium that were made for them, and so they didn't mind the sexualized women and didn't even notice that gay people didn't exist. What journalists like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian were doing was calling for maybe just a little bit more respect towards women. To have games appeal to a slightly wider audience by not being offensive or disgusting to any women that might play the games that were out at the time. But what these people on POL did was spin this very respectful request and critique of the gaming industry from these journalists into something to be feared by the predominant demographic of these video games. Look at what these women are trying to do and to take from you. Look at what this progressive hippie ideology would do if you let it go too far. That kind of thing. It's the kind of thing that you see the alt-right spin all the time. These people created the fear in a larger demographic that the games that were made for them would be taken away. That anybody that tried to make a change in the gaming industry and wanted games to not be made with one single demographic in mind were trying to take them away from them entirely. This is how pretty much every alt-right hate movement gains its population. This is how to radicalize a normie. Watch this whole video if you haven't and are interested. Alt-right movements are built off the insecurities and fear of people who are already in the majority. And because this is how Gamergate was built, this fear, which was redirected into hate, was not only directed at people who were calling for reform in the games industry, but also towards anything that wasn't prototypical of what the cishet man expected from their video games. Enter Dear Esther and Gone Home. Dear Esther came out first, and the response to it was a little more tame compared to what happened with Gone Home, probably because it doesn't have gay people in it, but it still had a lot of venom spat towards it in the same way people will spit at The Catcher in the Rye and say that it's a stupid book that has no right to be as respected as it is. People attacked Dear Esther because it challenged what a video game could actually be, and since the video game which was made for the cishet man was a game which required a sort of interactivity which Dear Esther most definitely did not present, a sort of disgust was shown towards Dear Esther, and it was labeled not as a video game, but instead a program which simulated walking, hence the term, the walking simulator. If I haven't made it clear already, the term walking simulator was created as a way to demean a specific type of game. As a label, it oversimplified what these games were doing in a way to turn people against those games without even thinking about it. The term came with a connotation which said that the only thing to do in these games is walk. And while in some ways that might be true, that's kind of the point of the genre as a whole, and is where the genre creates most of its value. There's a term that I really like that was coined by Serkan Şengün to describe the primary storytelling mode that walking simulators employ that make them so unique. Ludic voyeurism. Ludic refers to the fact that it's a game that we can play, and voyeurism is the act of watching others. Simplified. There's a lot of definition and art theory that goes into voyeurism. So if you want to take the term out of academic fancy speak, you can pretty much just translate it into interactive stalking. That translation does bring a bit of negative connotation along with it, but you get the idea. Voyeurism is a theme you will come across all the time across literature when you start to look for it. And there are a billion pages of art theory that discuss it in various different works. But in the paper where the term was pitched, Şengün uses the novel The Museum of Innocence by Turkish author Orhan Pamuk as a reference point for what ludic voyeurism even is. The Museum of Innocence is used as a reference frame because the novel was actually adapted into a real-life legit museum in Istanbul by Pamuk in 2012, filled with memorabilia that parallels the objects and the plot of the novel. When compared to Gone Home, the game which is at the heart of Shengyun's discussion, there are a lot of similarities. You are given the ability to peer into the lives of people you never met, you cannot interact or change the story, and there is an interactive element to it. More specifically, there is a story being told to the audience by way of broken up narration and the sight of things, items, scenery, etc., which were a part of a story that has already come and gone, and you as the audience get to explore that story which has already passed. The difference which Shengyun identifies, though, between the Museum of Innocence and Gone Home is that in Gone Home, the main character, the person which you play as, is a tabula rasa, or literally a blank slate character. Gone Home's Caitlin, unlike Pamuk's Kamal, has very little information about her in the game, and what you are given about her is just enough to justify why she is able to enter the house and explore around, because that's what Gone Home is. You enter a house and explore it. But once the game has established why you are in the situation you are, Caitlin kind of disappears into the background as the story of her family takes over. Unlike how the Museum of Innocence is framed through the eyes of a fleshed out character with motivations and narration, Caitlin is simply kind of a plot device to get you in the house, and once she's achieved that, she gets out of the way of the player unless there is some context that needs to be given by way of her voice. It kind of reminds me a lot of the short story A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner, in that when the narrator doesn't matter, they don't really exist. The narrator in A Rose for Emily sinks back into a vague we when their opinion on the case of Emily Grierson aligns with the opinion of the community as a whole. And in the same way, Caitlin sinks behind the camera when her voice no longer matters. And the narratorlessness doesn't always have to be the same extent as Gone Home, or even in the same style. Firewatch is a game that is about voyeurism just as much as Gone Home is, but it's a game with as close to a narrative voice as you get in a video game, really, with the main character Henry, who is the person that talks to Delilah over the radio. When you see something interesting in the game to look at, Henry is the one that reports what he's seeing to the radio, to Delilah, and so everything is filtered through him as long as he's talking to Delilah. However, you aren't always talking to her, and in the moments that you have by yourself, Henry sinks back into the background and you're left with your own thoughts. And I promise I'm trying my best not to talk about the beginner's guide because Lord knows I've talked about that game enough, but in that game, there is no narrator in the same way either Caitlin or Henry is. Yeah, Davey is talking to you and he's narrating the story of the game, of his relationship with Coda, but there is no filter here and you are the person that is witnessing the story. Davey is talking to you, the player. There is no main character you are playing as that's acting as a proxy for your experiencing the story. You are watching Davey have a breakdown in the game. You are a character in the game. In effect, games which employ ludic voyeurism provide gamers with a way of experiencing stories which would otherwise not be very conducive to the video game, because as is a major theme in the Museum of Innocence, we all kind of have a voyeuristic streak in us. Like, walking simulators give us a way of observing people safely from a distance where we do not run the risk of doing anything morally incorrect because the people we are watching are not real. Killian Biscop takes this even further and says that the walking simulator and its ludic aspects allow for the player to engage with and experience perspectives safely, specifically with regards to gender and sexuality. Gone Home, for example, gives the player the space to engage with both being a woman, a teenage girl, and being gay. And that space is safe for people to engage with, whether they are questioning their gender or sexuality, or if they just want to understand a perspective different from their own. The ability to tell stories about people and nothing else is so infinitely valuable for any medium, and the walking simulator gives gamers the ability to experience stories about regular people like you and me, just as the novel gave us the ability to do that in the written form. There's an essay by Merit Kopas in the book Queer Game Studies that demonstrates why this kind of story is so valuable and speaks to the power of not just Gone Home, but walking simulators in general. She writes, "Look, I am a trans woman who is not done grieving her childhood. My family moved around a lot when I was a kid. I have kind of weird and important associations with the Pacific Northwest, having lived out here for the past 4 years and it having been the first place I've lived as a queer woman. And I only discovered Riot Girl a couple years ago. I wish I'd had access to it in that childhood that I'm still dealing with. I know I'm bringing a lot of my own stuff to this game. I know my experience of it is being shaped by my history, even more because the player character is a kind of cipher with no real spatial storytelling to indicate much of substance about her relationship to any of the other characters in the game. I know all that, and honestly, I don't really fucking care. because this is a game that feels like it was made for me. And that's rare and important, and at the end of the day, especially in a medium that caters overwhelmingly to straight boys, universality can suck it. Walking simulators were initially labeled as such by gamers abusing Steam's tagging system because they were games that were made for audiences that did not have games that they could call their own. And it's precisely because these games were made for audiences that did not have games to call their own that walking simulators have since stuck around. Because walking simulators found a way to tell stories about people that seldom had stories told about them in a way that had never been done before, they have been able to survive even today and see wide critical acclaim. Ian Danskin from Innuendo Studios, when talking about Dear Esther, points out one of the reasons why Dear Esther, and by extension every other walking simulator, works so well is because you are in control of the pace at which the story advances.
Dear Esther is a dense text, dense with visual and narrative information. If a book is dense, your primary option for unpacking it is to, upon finishing it, reread it and see if you notice more this time. You can't spend more time in the book because the only way to be in its world is to be progressing towards the end of the book. Dear Esther only takes about an hour and a half to play beginning to end, but you have the freedom to spend 3, 5, 10 hours poring over the details, of which there are a lot. This dreamlike world will end after about a minute, but this one won't, not until you choose to proceed. What the game can do that books, movies, and dreams can't is allow you to linger.
So not only does the walking simulator work so well because it's a genre which allows stories to be told through the video game medium, which would otherwise not work in such a medium, but it's also because it allows us to tell stories in a way that no other medium allows. We get stories like Gone Home, where we get to watch a young woman learn and accept that she's gay. We get stories like Firewatch, which tells of isolation and explores what might make someone to isolate themselves. We get stories like The Beginner's Guide, which is so layered in narrative deceit from the get-go that a lot of people don't realize it's fictional and uses that fact to enhance its discussion about artistry and authorship. And we get stories like What Remains of Edith Finch, where the villain in the story of Family Legacy is hidden behind so many details, hidden about a massive, massive house, and where the only way to figure out that Edie is the villain of the story is to find and analyze all of those details, which takes a while. And all of that are experiences which can only be gotten from a video game. Which is all to say, if there's one thing that the walking simulator is good at, it's breaking the rules by being more and more mundane. And that's what matters. Instead of raising the stakes and making games which tell sweeping stories that take hundreds of hours to complete, there is a genre which tells stories which are much more meaningful and more impactful and oftentimes more elaborate, and can only do so by limiting the gameplay to simply walking and looking over the course of a handful of hours. More and more people and developers are both playing and making more story-driven games that focus more on story and less gameplay. Hell, even Hideo frickin' Kojima has been pretty much leading the charge into games that tell more sophisticated stories in this modern era of gaming, when most people thought he finished that with Metal Gear. Death Stranding introduced walking simulators to the masses in a way which no other game had, and DS2 is probably going to do that same thing again once that comes out. And I'm expecting him to do it again with that really fucking strange game that he teased a while back with Hunter Schafer. I think it's important to keep in mind what makes the walking simulator important and what makes it work as the genre widens. We have so many games either coming out or on the horizon that follow this formula, like Still Wakes the Deep from the same team that made Dear Esther. We have the studio Ivy Road, founded by, in part, Davey Wreden, the writer of The Stanley Parable and The Beginner's Guide. And we have publishers like Annapurna Interactive, which make their specialty in these sorts of indie games. So as this genre expands, it's important to understand that these games work because they add interactivity and a layer of safety to simple observation, because they make a game out of people watching and our inherent curiosity about other people's lives. And I think we should remember that it's important to tell stories like that, and that the video game makes these stories work in a way that no other medium can. And we should respect those games. Engage with those stories, because maybe someday we'll undo what Roger Ebert did to this medium and will convince people that video games can be art.